Ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou, ko au te uru o te erawa maangai nui, ko Shiloh Groot hau. Warm greetings to you all. I'm a descendant from the Te Arawa Nation, and my name is Shiloh Groot. Kind of had a bit of trouble trying to decide what to talk about today. I've been naughty and I haven't been coming along to these talks, so that probably doesn't help. But I was trying to figure out, should I be doing some intellectual flexing and waxing lyrical about the latest theoretical fashion that I'm into, current projects I'm involved in, or I'm moving into that mid-career space now, so should I look across the breadth of my research and talk to that? Should I make some pointed comments about apathy in academia? So I thought, fuck it, why not do all of the above? So this is either going to be 40 minutes or it's 2 hours worth of content trying to pack into 40 minutes, so we'll see. It's also a bit of an experiment. I've said yes, I must be popular at the moment. I've said yes to a few talks, and so this is kind of the first, so you get to be my guinea pigs, so feedback is welcome, if I leave enough time at the end, of course, but feedback is welcome. Also want to acknowledge, thank you for inviting me to this talk, to give this talk. I also want to acknowledge the terrorist attacks that happened on our Muslim communities, our Muslim whanaunga, and that we're in a delicate space and trying to negotiate a pathway forward that is meaningful and collaborative. So, like everybody else, I wrote the abstract before I really had an idea of what I'm going to talk about, but I always am endlessly preoccupied with this idea of deviance as someone from a working class background and the complexities that brings with that and the abruptness that can of class transitions as occurring within academia, and sometimes being made to feel out of place on the basis of class and race and other spheres that I occupy. So deviance as resistance has always occupied me, and homelessness is something that I've been researching for the past 10, 11 years. And we're at a really interesting point in New Zealand history. We're at an unprecedented point. Previous governments, doesn't matter whether it's national or Labour, have never acknowledged it as a social issue in our communities. But this particular government has come in on that bandwagon that we need to do something about resolving homelessness. So that's an exciting space to be in. It's a critical space to be in. But there's, of course, there's issues around the way in which we conceptualise homelessness that kind of narrows the conversation we can have and how we respond to homelessness. So I want to talk about the homeless community, the ways in which they resist that kind of that lack of understanding of their life worlds, and how we could respond meaningfully. So even though my name was the first on the slide, I'm actually a part of a team of researchers. This is some of the people I work with, predominantly Darren Hodges, Linda Waimaria Nikora, Ngā Te Awa Kotoku, Mohiroa. There's other people that we published alongside of who are students or colleagues whose work intersects with ours. Broadly speaking, it's homelessness and urban poverty. We're a team of Māori and allied researchers, so Māori are at the forefront of our concerns here when we're talking about homelessness and poverty. So our work seeks to respond to those inequities. So we've looked at different aspects of homelessness. You could broadly say we're interested in the lived experiences of homelessness. So for myself, I'm probably most well known, or my work is most often associated with Indigenous homelessness or Māori homelessness. We've looked at from the perspective of practitioners, clinicians, look at a class analysis, the way in which that plays out in our responses to homelessness, who we're more empathetic towards, versus who we're more frustrated by, or who we will label as deviant and be less responsive to. Humanising our approaches, structural violence that exasperates experiences of homelessness and beds the likelihood of homelessness for some communities. So like I said, I'm a part of a team. I'm drawing on our joint work, some of which I've led, some of which I've supported and collaborated with. So as a team, what has preoccupied our interest? What brings all of us together? We span different universities, we span different disciplines. What brings us together? We want to understand the efforts of socio-economically marginalised Māori to survive, well, not only to survive, but also thrive in austere times. What does socio-economic marginalisation look like in the everyday lives of people, not just the abrupt events, but their everyday lives and practices of Māori? What are their restraints on human flourishing for Māori? And importantly, how do Māori deploy cultural connections and practices and ways of being to cope and push against the boundaries of those socioeconomic restrained life worlds, and ways that can promote human flourishing? How do they engender community in the face of adversity and a lack of compassion or interest? or engagement with Māori lifefords? And what are the practical implications? No theory without action. A bit deeper understanding of poverty and homelessness in general for the promotion of human flourishing. So these are some broad questions that govern our work. So how are we going about investigating these? If I'm looking across the decade of work that I've been involved in, so we've engaged in the research in Aotearoa New Zealand from 2007, well at least I have, to the present, but this work also predates me. The team that I'm a part of is made up of senior researchers who did this in the UK as well as New Zealand before I came along. So we've done this through a multi-method approach, which includes intensive field work, volunteer work, direct observations, staff workshops, biographical interviews, lobbying, advocacy, agency workshops, photo elicitation projects. And this talk draws on the accounts in particular of some of our early research with 24 Māori homeless people and the physicians, the nurses, the counsellors and allied health professionals working in Tauranga, Hamilton and Auckland. So it originally started as a multi-year project, at least its New Zealand counterpart, and was launched through the Māori and Psychology Research Unit at the University of Waikato, and key members of those organisations have chosen to stay involved in this research. So one aspect that I'll be focusing on today is that this research involves photographic projects where homeless people are given cameras to take pictures of aspects of their everyday lives. And it's as simple as that in many respects. But in order to do that, in order to be able to engage with these communities, or relationships come first in our work, the research comes second. So it often means that research takes a long time. Those relationships are ongoing, they don't end with the conclusion of the publication of an article. So what informs this approach? Those small acts of humanity that are informed by multicultural practices like whanaungatanga, manaakitanga, wairoatanga, that permeate our research and shape our processes of engagement. So the importance of just being Māori together. So this is a series of images that I really enjoy using and I use quite often. I just find it a really powerful way to summarise the sort of fuckery of our responses towards homelessness. So this image here, I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. So this in architectural terms is hostile architecture. So the public perception in my abstract I note of Māori homelessness is shaped by these long-standing prejudices against populations whose lives are lived on the margins of society. So hostile architecture is where we redesign the structure of the city to exclude and include different groups. So we want consumers to move through and we want them to move through quickly, but we don't want certain groups like young people, disabled people, people with disabilities, people, ethnic minorities. We don't want certain people to hang around in the city. So there's ways in homeless people that we structure the city to stop people from being able to form communities, you could say. So this is hostile architecture, those spikes. So you can see spikes that are ascending from the park bench. So if you want them to compress, if you want them to go down, you have to put a coin into that slot under there, and that's the only way you can sit down. So cities spend thousands. We don't have quite the same architecture, say, in Auckland City or across New Zealand, but we do have aspects of that. Benches with divides so people can't lie down. You have sort of those flat spikes that makes it uncomfortable for people to sit down. You have hoses that go off at particular times of the night so that homeless people can't sleep in doorways and things like that. You have security that moves them on. You have all sorts of different tactics for moving homeless people on. You could say hostile architecture is apparent in institutions like WINS, or even around the university if you have a disability. So it's a kind of urban design that's intended to control, coerce, and often prohibit interaction and social relations in public space. So many cities that have invested in these homeless torture infrastructures, they spend thousands to install obstacles preventing homeless people from sleeping, standing, or sitting, or in parks, under bridges, and next to public transportation. So what kind of society does it say about us then when we respond to homelessness with spikes? And there's a more human face, you could say, on this government in terms of responding to homelessness, but our understanding of homelessness is still narrow, so our responses tend to be very much narrow as well. And I'll get into that a bit more. But what's missing in these accounts? What's missing in these responses is a human account of homelessness and enhances the mana of whānau experiencing hardship. So these two images were taken by an older Māori homeless woman to centre the resilience of the Māori homeless community, to convey the enactment of concepts such as manaakitanga, spirituality, wairuatanga, manaakitanga, reciprocal care, wairuatanga, spirituality or spiritual connectedness, whanaungatanga, relatedness. So these are the core building blocks of Te Ao Māori, the Māori world. So they were taken by her. The picture on the left of the matua holding up the two carvings that he learned how to carve in prison. So this is something, space used to be provided at LifeWise in their old building where he could do some carving. He would gift this to staff who were moving on, as well as homeless people who were transitioning back into housing. And so the woman who took the pictures, she would bless them so that they could then be given on to other people. And so the couple that you can just see a little white speck. It's her tonga that she's wearing. So she has maintained a good relationship with her stepfather. He gave her that tonga. She's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is a contested term that doesn't always take into account the spiritual understandings Māori have of such disorders. So for her, when she was given this, it was upsetting she was feeling the reverberations between those states of tapu and no, the sacred and the otherworldly, the sacred and the profane. And so she asked the woman who was taking the picture if she could bless it for her so that to settle those sort of reverberations, those spiritual reverberations, which she did. And so she started to feel much better, and she wanted her to take a photo of her in a much happier state. So there's this idea that they form a community as well. Alternatives to oppressive welfare exist, and the current government will need to engage with these more. A focus on human rights that adopt anti-oppressive orientations and promote human flourishing are absolutely sustainable. So obviously giving people cameras isn't going to resolve homelessness. So what are the purpose in picturing homelessness? Some of it's about rendering the situation real for people. Some of it, this is just a tool for engagement. Social scientists use visual methodologies in ways that are probably quite naive in comparison to, say, art historians. It's just a tool for engagement in many ways. We don't get caught up on the still object. It's not the still object that's necessarily important, like these images I'm showing you. It's the meaning imbued by our participants that give it meaning. So we approached streeties, as they prefer to be called, and they went out to picture their life worlds. So we approached them as urban commentators, and we asked them to retransit, reconvey, reconsider their street lives for people who are perhaps a very distance from it. I might come from a working class background, but I've never been homeless. So people experiencing hardship have a stock of experiential knowledge, or phronesis, and the aim is to draw on these knowledges as a basis for theorising issues and developing responses. So sure, taking pictures of homelessness isn't going to resolve their situation, but it can help us understand their lived life worlds and conceptualise action frameworks that actually take into account their own strengths and capacities, rather than the tendency to have a top-down, look-down approach on it. So knowledge of what happens in interactions between institutions and whānau, or institutions and people, is centrally important for improving these interactions, and as well as challenging those structures which are produced or reproduced through them. So our task wasn't just to code or analyse and interpret these photos, is to theorise how homeless people appropriate mundane spaces. This could be under bridges, alleyways, public toilets, and then layer those spaces with new meanings. So we're interested into trying to see homelessness more from people's own perspectives and use this information to inform responses. So these imaginative journeys also take us well beyond the street life, and sometimes you can think of the frame of a photograph as leaky and fuzzy. The meaning will transcend that still image. So you have the image of obviously a headstone there. So we met the person who's taking the photo, as well as the guy who's standing in the bottom of the photo, when they were in detox, the detoxifications facility that's behind Auckland City Mission. So we approached some people there through the agency, and you couldn't leave that place without being you needed supervision in order to leave that place. So we accompanied myself and the other woman who's in that photo accompanied them. So one place that was key in their pathways to homelessness, or what homelessness meant to them, was took us to a graveyard. So one of the people had lost his mother. He'd always had issues with depression and some substance use issues, and so once he lost his mother, that was his home, that was his support, that was everything gone. So his early experiences of homelessness was sleeping on her grave, as well as the man who was standing with us in the photo at the bottom. And so, also as a cultural insider in terms of being Māori, and the person who was taking the photos, who was Pākehā, myself and the other homeless people were observing and feeling those moments of cultural shock, because I don't think I'd ever accompanied a Pākehā person through a graveyard before. So there's very different ways in which that they might approach it. That was almost a moment of culture shock. So there's interesting in that those boundaries also between researcher and participant can be blurred at times. It is about reducing that hierarchy and elevating those relationships and honouring those relationships as well. So, purpose a little bit of that blurb just then about the relationships that make somewhere home and what happens when those relationships fall apart. Because home is where everything starts. When we have the homelessness, we have the homeless, because our idea of home includes the possibility of being without home. So you can be at home, but you can lose that home. So this is what particularly interests me about home, particularly as an Indigenous person, particularly as someone who's Māori. It's contradictions, it's impossibility. Even if home is the place where you belong, and assumedly where you have a nice life, there's always the potential to lose that. So this complexity, this conundrum is the whole point. Home is never something that's safe, that's neat and clean. It's something that's contested within and outside, something that is lost and can be reappropriated. So what I try to argue is that one can also be homeless even when they're at home. So in contrast, even if you live on the street, you have a lot of relationships of affection and care that we might consider central to this idea, this concept of home. So I've got these pages up that were taken from different homeless people that kind of talk a little bit about the cultural patterning of home, the way in which we imagine home in unhomely spaces. Is there any pictures up there that anyone would like me to explain? Don't know how well I can see them. Huh?
Do you know the story behind the dog?
Yeah. So, that dog is probably one of the most well-loved dogs you'll ever come across. So there's a particular older Māori homeless man who's very famous who's very well known amongst the street community for his dogs. So he has about 2 of them, and everybody feeds them, and they're fed first, and they're cared for. You can see the little bed that's set up for people whose home lives may not have been characterised by safety, by flourishing relationships, by care. This is a way in being more than just the passive recipient of charity, but a way in which you can be loved and show loved. So companion animals are incredibly important for a lot of homeless people. It also means it can be difficult for them to ascertain housing, because the criteria, anyone who's got pets and is renting will know it's damn near impossible. It's hard to find a place that would let you take in pets, and it's same with different social housing supports. So, and the person who actually took that photo wasn't the guy whose dogs those are, but one person who feels that loneliness keenly and would dearly love a dog.
Can't read the text on that bottom one.
So the text says on the bottom right image.
Yeah.
So resistance futile, suicidal ideas. I will crucify my own being to satisfy myself. So this is one of the ones that I went on a walk along with participants in Detox, and I'm fascinated by street art, street poetry, and graffiti in general, so I asked them to take a photo. They had the photo that you see there is what they originally intended, and I wanted to close up with that one. Because we all do this, we hang up art in our places, we do things to make our spaces more homely, whether you're renting, whether you own a home, whether you're still at home, whatever, ways in which we try and make our space more homely. So it's similar in that you can see they've got decorations and that ornamental pumpkin back in the background there, there's glass, there's an ashtray, there's art on the walls that they've drawn themselves. the ways in which you try and create home in the most unhomely, perhaps, of spaces. And you can also see different things, and you can draw different conclusions. It's tidily stacked. A lot of Māori always point out, it reminds me of marae, the way in which it's neatly stacked. You're respectful of the space of others, your belongings are associated with your beds, and the fact that they've got mattresses. So in sort of the hierarchy of street homelessness, these are sort of your middle class streeties, you could say. Cars being slightly being elevated. Any other image of interest?
Top left is a detail of the tree, is it? I was wondering what it's kind
Yeah.
of showing.
So I've got terrible sense of geography, terrible sense of direction, but students often point out this is Albert Park, what is that? Okay, yep. So yeah, this is the different aspects of the tree. So that's a little bit inside it. There's the from a distance and from more of a distance. So about 7 homeless people used to sleep in this tree or around it and in it. Relationships form. A baby was conceived there. What happens is when, if you're tagged as homeless, when you're a mother or an expectant mother, your SIFs is of course notified, and the child is immediately removed once you give birth to that child. It's incredibly brutal. Good friends and colleagues with Māori midwives who work with street homeless women, and I talk about this horrible story they always tell me in terms of running up the maternity ward. They've just been given the text, okay, I need to come there and intervene before SIFs come, so they've got that opportunity for a little bit of skin-to-skin contact. Getting that call, so they're running up and then they hear a woman scream, not a labour cry. Knowing the difference, I guess. It's just incredibly brutal. But yeah, so there's a cultural practice associated in terms of being able to bury the baby's placenta. So because the child's removed, they can't do that because it's that kind of, it's not occurring when where those in the hokainga, they can't necessarily bury there either. So all sorts of disruptions to home that happens, the instability of home, the tyranny of stability, and that our approaches are so narrow as well. So I already said at the same time you can be homeless even if you have a conventional home. As a threat of losing, it's always there. So your house can be appropriated by a bank if you mortgage to the hilt and the interest goes up. It can be appropriated by the bank. Your relationships can end. People pass away. You may find instead belonging and safety on the streets. But when you have a real house, you might experience the precarity of being homeless. So this is the case for a lot of young people experiencing homelessness, where they either must stay in situations of abuse and suffer in silence, or leave and live on the street. So there's a lot of work on violence, familial and intimate partner violence, patriarchy and misogyny that shows you can be at home while not feeling at home. So my work is actually kind of about the opposite. It's about how can people who do not have a home feel at home, particularly for Māori, if we've experienced homelessness at the national, the iwi, the hapu, the whānau, and personal level. So what does home mean in that sense? So what I wanted to show in these images is that people who are homeless have a community. They're not just resilient. They make life. They don't just get by or survive. And this is a life that's characterised by caring relationships. The image down there in particular. They refer to each other as family, the family you choose. From the outside, their lives can look messy and chaotic, but it works to a degree. It's a life that is characterised by caring relationships and by an economy. So the person down there is perhaps one of the most well-known at the time. In early 2000s was one of the most well-known beggars and successful beggars or panhandlers. So from the outside it can look messy and chaotic, but it works. And when they're actually eventually evicted, locked out, so councils will go through in places like this once they're discovered. If they cannot stay under the radar, and if they come to our attention and they're moved on, they're locked out, council will block over these places. They're not able to replicate those lives, those places of belonging outside. So many get jailed, others are dispersed, they might move across the country, go somewhere else, but they lose that capacity to be alive, to construct their deviant life. And many die. So this is the result of the rejection by the institutions of the possibility of a life underground. The institution, so that's the institutional accepted norm that rejects the possibility that you can function even if you're an addict and a beggar, a sex worker, and you live on the streets. So the point I'm trying to make here is not that homeless people should be maintained on the streets necessarily, but that we do need a kind of politics able to appreciate first and embrace second the proposition that's made by people like this, the proposition that this is a life arrangement created by them which doesn't work. It just stops to live when it's captured into these normative understandings of home, of belonging and acceptability. So definitions are important in mobilising funders and mobilising governments. They can also be restrictive, and they're still very much centred on that tyranny of stability, assumptions of stability. So in New Zealand, our definition includes social, physical and legal domains as they intersect with housing, but it is useful in the sense that it's able to capture movement. So homelessness is a population marked by transience, so people might be on the streets for a short while, couch surfing, move into transitional housing, supportive housing, might obtain a private rental, but this is constant shift. So it's able to capture at least that movement. It's also able to capture this idea that homelessness isn't just a lack of shelter, it is the absence of safe, secure and habitable shelter. But what's missing, what's always missing from such official definitions, is an understanding of the unique characteristics of homelessness for Indigenous peoples. So it doesn't include spiritual homelessness, for example. That what occurs, that displacement from ancestral lands, our knowledge, rituals and kinship relationships. It's more than just bricks and mortar. So what we do currently know, drawing on conservative figures, 2013 census figures that try to capture some of the living situations in New Zealand, is that close to 1 in every 100 New Zealanders are estimated to be homeless. So 51% are under 25 years old and 52% are working or studying or both. And we also know that Māori are overrepresented in homeless populations.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
That was a 2013 reference?
2013, yeah.
Yeah, any idea what that would look like now, unofficially?
So I think some of those questions have been taken out for this round of census questioning. And so there's always arguments around defining homelessness and making it's always centred on measurement, wanting more accurate measurements, which is an impossibility when thinking about homelessness as a state of constant transience. So some of those questions were taken out. It's conservative because you're only going to capture people who might have other tenants living with them that would be in breach of their tenancy and not going to be disclosing that there's other people living with them. So those conditions around overcrowding you miss. You're not going to get people living under a bridge, of course. You're not going to capture that spectrum necessarily. You're going to get a very small, narrow wedge of what homelessness looks like in our country. So those are conservative estimates. But I haven't seen, there's been calls to update it, but I haven't seen what's happening yet with the latest census. And I just know that some of those questions were taken out. So there's two kind of dominant thoughts around pathways, how people become homeless, or those pathways into homelessness, the personal and the structural. Personal comes out of the US, surprise, surprise. Structural comes out of the UK. In New Zealand, we try to weave both perspectives together. So pathways into and out of homelessness can be complex, of course. That means pathways out are equally complex. So this can include growing up in low-income households, experiencing racism in the rental market, that can impact the length of time spent in any one place, overcrowded and unaffordable housing, frequent upheaval and movement between communities, and schools that further disrupt kids' performance and community support networks. So most people have an awareness of those personal pathways and often draw on them to reproduce those shared narratives we have of homeless people, who they are, what they do, how they came to be homeless. So that issue with an individual level of analysis is homelessness becomes reimagined as a personal choice, and it's got to be one of my biggest pet peeves is when people assign it as a personal choice, as a lifestyle choice. And sometimes homeless people themselves will draw on these shared narratives, as well as simultaneously rejecting and challenging those narratives. So personal pathways can either engender pity or contempt in the public, and policymakers alike. So it can either be seen as evidence of personal deficits and urban deviance, which results in fines, imprisonments. When you can't pay those fines, you get imprisoned. Zoning laws increase security in public institutions like libraries. The removal of citizen rights. Or a more empathetic approach might mean housing a person who we imagine are just like us and going through a bit of a hard time. So either way, we just need to fix the individual when we focus on those personal pathways. Structural can be a little bit harder for people to understand, and it can be short-sighted. So our current approaches are very much honing in on housing as a solution to homelessness. And it's very much called on that material understanding of homelessness, and extracted from structural issues like poverty that embed generations in situations of homelessness, or in the ways in which it's inscribed on our whakapapa as Māori, in many sense thanks to colonial machinations. So, no nation is a blank historical state. Homelessness for Māori, as I've already said, has occurred at those different levels, spanning from national, iwi, hapu, whānau, and personal. It's the deliberate mass impoverishment of Indigenous peoples through that brutal extraction of resources. So in contemporary Aotearoa New Zealand, these has grave consequences for health and identity. So we live with the constant reminders of the ongoing impacts of colonisation in terms of those disproportionate rates of death by suicide, domestic violence, homicide, substance use and addiction, mass incarceration that occurs over generations and disrupts communities, hospitalisation, children forcibly removed and taken into state care, mental illness, homelessness and ill health, and these are all intertwined. In comparison to Aotearoa's settler society, the benchmark that we all must meet and that we are all measured by. So today, colonisation then is reproduced in those everyday instances when, say, Māori mothers have to adopt a subservient persona that is acceptable to colonial institutions in order to face just a little less stigma, denigration and racism when trying to access support to feed their kids. We wouldn't have to beg for help if we still held guardianship over our resources, which were confiscated illegally to service the needs of the settler society. So colonisation for a lot of continues to mean displacement from that which makes us who we are as Māori. So it has created a landscape of dominance within which our lives continue to be scarred, which struggles for survival and wellness are endured and borne across generations. So I'll use 3 particular people just very quickly, as I suspected, I've got far too much content. Anyone know what this is an image of? You haven't been in one of these stores? Don't have to tell me what you think it means, just asking, do you know what this store is? You ever travel overseas and need a fridge magnet? Souvenir Store, right? So this is an image taken by 17-year-old twins, Charlotte and Rachel, pseudonyms, of a souvenir shop in Auckland. So the twins were removed from their whānau as infants and placed in state care. They spent most of their lives separated from each other and were moved from foster home to foster home, occasionally returning home to their whānau and then being removed again, and they were later reunited at 17 years old when guardianship officially ended. So we have changed that, it's now 18, and in some cases it can continue on to 21. Make of that what you will. Charlotte and Rachel had been living on the streets of Auckland when I met them for about 2 months and were engaging in sex work illegally as minors to earn money and food. So these activities were bringing them into conflict with the judicial system as well as older, more established sex workers along K Road at the time. So the souvenir shop for them was a place that they often returned to and which helped to alleviate feelings of moki-moki or loneliness for the home and cultural relationships that give life and meaning to such spaces, that engender home. So they go to the shop, they touch their objects, they admire the pounamu, the greenstone, and through this act they gain some tangible sense of what it means to be Māori, a connection to things Māori, that loss of whanaungatanga, that interconnectedness and wairuatanga, that spirituality is keenly felt by these twins as a type of spiritual homelessness. So this is the living embodiment of spiritual homelessness. So if Māori are overrepresented in the homeless population, then we need to ensure that Māori perspectives are interwoven in meaningful ways and not in tokenistic ways. into any response strategy to provide that bridge between past and present and current contexts. Past and current contexts of homelessness and a future ideal state where homelessness does no longer exist. I'm just going to let you guys read this and I'll talk in the background. So this is Donna, a 39-year-old, at the time, Māori woman who describes herself as a mental health survivor, alluding to these dysfunctional aspects of a social system that removes children without necessarily offering suitable alternative environments. So many Māori precariat families, many working class whānau, don't necessarily abuse their children, but young members of the precariat, when they are faced with family violence and abuse, often have fewer options and resources. So many Māori adults attribute their earliest entrance into homelessness to their removal from whānau. State care intervention is a common thread, not just for Māori, but across homeless people's experiences. By social services in childhood and the abuse, the neglect and discrimination endured whilst in state care. So the link between experiences in state care and homelessness, that structural violence is concerning, given that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, over 60% of children in state care are Māori. Further, as of about December 2016, over 60% of children in out-of-home placements are Māori. But that last sentence, social welfare came to get me and they locked me up, as a 7-year-old speaks to those dysfunctional aspects of a social system that just brutally extracts and doesn't necessarily consider the next steps around homing, I guess you could say. So Aria, this is the woman who took the pictures that I first showed you in contrast to hostile architecture. She's a woman in her 50s at the time, so she'll be in her 60s now. She has been rehoused. She is someone whose childhood was immersed in the teachings of tikanga Māori, particularly of rongoa, a traditional application of medicinal herbs, by her grandmother, and her grandmother would feed and look after other children in the whānau, but couldn't necessarily protect her from the abuse at the hands of other whānau members. So she ran away around about age 12, this is quite common, to escape those experiences of abuse. She spent time in Wellington, she spent time in Auckland. She would be found, she'd be brought back to her family, she'd run away, the abuse would continue, she'd run away, she'd go back to the streets. Eventually around about 17, she met and was mentored by an older Māori homeless woman named Ma, who affectionately known as Ma by the street community, and all older Māori homeless people remember her well, who noticed that her skill in the application of rongoa and suggested she train as a nurse aide, which she did for a long time, so she left the streets for a long time, had 3 children. She has a lot of involvement with the queer community, this queer street community. But once her partner died, she developed advanced carpal syndrome. Those key supports, those key connectors or anchoring points to home fell apart. She returned to the place where she knew she belonged, where she knew of safety, where she knew how to navigate the streets. And 3 different generations of her whānau live on the streets as well in Auckland. So she came back to awhi them, you could say, support them. I'm aware. So this is a quote from her that probably one of my favourite quotes from her. She's talking about one of the times when she ran away and came to the streets, and then her grandmother came to try and get her to come back home. Her kuia came to try and collect her and come back home, and just being judgmental and seeing other whānau members also living on the streets, and just in general looking at these urban Māori, which tends to be code for deficits and disconnection. So I told my grandmother, because she's being very judgmental, I'm at home, it's our whenua, I'm tangata whenua, and I'm still here. So for Indigenous peoples, that spiritual homelessness can occur when you're separated from your ancestral land, family and kinship networks. Ari and others in her family who are living on the streets of Auckland, they can be dislocated from those spaces and those places. However, they can still centre themselves around family-based relationships through the enactment of whakawhanaungatanga in Auckland, that relatedness, that represent. In the process, they can maintain a sense of identity and mitigate those feelings of moke or loneliness or spiritual dislocation. So the presence of her grandmother then represents a strong physical embodiment between those living on the streets of Auckland and members of the family or the whānau who still live on their ancestral land. So it provides a continuity between the here and there, you could say, to disrupt that dislocation they experience as homeless people. And I've ended with an example of Aria because She is the one who blessed her taonga. This is the young woman in the photo. She is the one who brought these two girls to the service providers, because as young people they avoid it, particularly if they're affiliated with different religious organisations. And she is the one who blesses the taonga that the Māori man carves. So they're a community, and they foster home even in the most unlikely or unhomely of spaces. So people like Adi are incredibly important. Not all Māori have access to Te Ao Māori, but not all Māori are berefit either. Not all of those are without hope. Pane me te rawakore is an old, very old saying, talking about the concept of homelessness pre-contact. So it used to be one of the harshest forms of social punishment, much more feared than any other form of punishment, you could say. So people like Adi are important for reconnecting, for supporting, for buffering that spiritual homelessness. So maybe some of our responses should be around mobilising people like that with those skills. And I'm going to end on this slide. So, how to make research in a way that's meaningful is probably the question we all tackle with and have to come to terms with in one way or another. How do you make it research in a way that is meaningful for the people you are researching? How can they appropriate your research and use it to enhance their own lives or their own efforts? How do we disrupt that complacency of being an academic? It can be uncomfortable and it can be difficult, and it's sure as shit not always supported by the institution. But it's critical for realising core aspirations for Māori to live well, to leave improved legacies for future generations, and to remain distinctly Māori. So it's about relationships. I've tried to emphasise that in a way. These have been the relationships that have been maintained and occur over decades. Sometimes it's hard, sometimes you just want to shut those relationships down, you want those boundaries up. You just don't want to roll out to another bloody hui. There's all sorts of stuff. It's about relationships, yep, so you're entering with the community you work with. It doesn't just end with that publication or when you start rolling into publication mode. So relationships affects you and you affect them through what we do, what we write. What's written then has its own life and it takes on its own life. It's always interesting to come across people who've read my work in the sector. There's a book that we published that was meant for the general audience, and sometimes it surprises me depending on what circles I'm in, and then there's someone who bring it out. So it's about producing resources that they can appropriate as well. And I'll end there.